Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the library, and tonight I'm so delighted to be hosting a very special event which we organized in partnership with the Opéra Comique in honor of their upcoming production, Archipel. So tonight, to celebrate the show, which will be opening on April 25th, we are so delighted, so honored to be welcoming James Bonas, Ewan Jones, and Adrien Borne as they speak about this production. Just a couple of notes before we dive into it. After about 45 minutes, we're going to open this conversation up to questions from our in-person audience and from our Zoom audience who are trapped inside that camera right there and are probably at home right now, safe from this terrible weather. So if you're on Zoom, hello, congrats on staying dry, and please send in any questions that you have into the chat. And another note, Opéra Comique is generously offering discounted tickets to Archipel to members of the American Library in Paris, and we will be offering more information about how to purchase these after this event has concluded in a follow-up email. So stay tuned for that. You will be dying to see the show after you've heard a bit more about it. So it's very exciting. On to our brilliant, brilliant speakers tonight. Farthest left, we have Librettist Adrien Borne, who is the author of several award-winning novels in French, including Mémoire de Soi and La Vie qui Commence, published by J.C. Lattès.
Jean-Claude Lattès.
Voilà. As well as an adaptation of the opera Carmen for teenagers. He divides his time between writing, journalism, and public speaking, and his work explores the liberating powers of words and the stories they tell, whether fictional or real. Seated next to Adrien, we have James Bonas, who's a director who recently directed Leonard Bernstein's Candide at the Welsh National Opera with his regular collaborator, animation artist Grégoire Pont. The pair also directed the French premiere of Hans Abrahamsen's The Snow Queen for the Opéra National de Rhin and Karl Orff's Der Mond, and Maurice Ravel's L'Enfant et les Sortilèges and L'Heure Espagnole for the Opéra de Lyon. Voila. And finally, directly to my left, we have the brilliant choreographer Ewan Jones, who trained in musical theatre at the Arts Education Schools London and holds an MA in choreography. His work in musical theatre and opera has taken him around the world. Most recently, he returned from Dubai, where he was staging the critically acclaimed new version of Andrew Lloyd Webber's The Phantom of the Opera. In 2019, Jones also became movement coordinator and choreographer for seasons 2 and 3 of hit Netflix TV series Sex Education, which is super cool. And following that, he was invited to join Disney Plus as movement director for their upcoming series, The Ballad of Renegade Nell. So very impressive. So thank you all. So thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. Can we have a round of applause? So the point of tonight's event is to give everyone here an exclusive preview of what's to come in Archipel, to make you all so excited to go and see it. And what's so particular and so exciting about this show is that it was commissioned by and written alongside Maîtrise Populaire, which is the Maîtrise Populaire, which is the youth opera group of Opéra Comique. And so this show was inspired by a series of workshops conducted with the pupils. It's an exploration of childhood, curiosity, the rules we live in, the ways we choose or choose not to break them. It's about bravery, critical thought, and hope. And the fact that it was developed alongside the students themselves is so striking and so significant. So I'm hoping that before we dive into that, you can maybe briefly tell us what the Maîtrise Populaire is and how it was that the three of you came to be working with them.
I'll go first.
Go ahead.
I think this is audible, microphone-wise.
Incredibly audible.
Great. I think the Maîtrise Populaire, and I'm looking across at our producer, Margot, as I say this, so you can nod at me if I'm right and shake your head if I'm wrong, is interesting, particularly at the Opéra Comique, because there are a lot of maîtrises. I've worked with a maîtrise in Lyon as well, and they're traditionally attached to an opera house, and there'll be a sort of choir, generally, of young singers. And much as a children, I've worked in San Francisco, and they might have a children's chorus at the opera. And it's often that, and it's often, in the nicest of terms, populated by white middle-class children. it's like the kids that would join ballet class, because those are the kids whose parents are then, go ahead, go and do some opera and blah, blah, blah. It's just often that's the case. And there's a very brilliant woman called Sarah Coney who works with Opéra Comique. And the reason why it's the Maîtrise Populaire, I think is the name, particularly Sarah, was it 2016 she took over or somewhere around then, was to try to break that mold and to actually broaden the spectrum in terms of outreach of who gets to take part. And so instead of just auditioning in a fairly narrow band, I guess of more central inner Paris schools to find these kids who take part, she cast her net a lot wider in sort of wider Paris. And as a result, we've got a group of children in the Maîtrise, over 100, I think, in the total Maîtrise, 120 or something, from a very broad variety of backgrounds, with very different experiences of life, and they're starting around age 8, and then going right the way through university. And they're getting some dance classes, they're getting movement work, they get to take part in productions, they sing for the Rugby World Cup, I'm sure they'll be singing the Olympics. Bridget and Emmanuel are big fans. So I think that in a way it fulfills a lot of things, not least which is opening up sort of choral music, but also being part of a theatre, and a very brilliant theatre, I have to say, with an incredible tradition, to a range of people that might not have access to music education in a wide way. And that's one of the reasons you use Delacroix, isn't it? Which is a teaching musical technique, Delacroix, which doesn't require formal note reading. It's taught through sort of rhythm and a lot of work with the body, and it's very successful. And she's been very successful with the project. And so, I think that was relatively clear, this particular project came from wanting to create a piece of work that really came from those people. And so the project, I work with Louis Longray, who's now the sort of artistic director, conductor as well of the Opéra Comique, and I worked with him on L'Enfant les Sortilèges in Cincinnati when he was in charge of Cincinnati Symphony. And so he asked me to come and take part. Ewan and I have worked together a lot, and Adrian's a very brilliant writer with a connection to childhood, I think, Adrian, is fair to say. And I think the idea, along with that, with Isabelle Abouquet, who's not here tonight, who has an extraordinary history and breadth of experience of writing music for children, the idea was to create a piece that, I keep saying this, but I think it's a useful phrase, which we make with them rather than on them. So there's a huge tendency, I work a lot with kids, you work with kids, that you make work on children. And so the typical thing will be to go to a group of kids now and go, you must be worried about climate change, let's do something about plastic. Just, I mean, it's often that's what happens. You project onto them what you think they'll be concerned about. And so from the beginning, from Opéra Comique, and from us, the principle was to create a process or a way of developing the work that would try not to do that. And it's surprisingly difficult. Because when you get a bunch of teenagers, whether they're American or British or French, they're a bunch of teenagers. Do you know what I mean? And they don't trust you. They don't know you. And also, it's very hard for children, I think, to realize that you actually want to know what they think. You don't want to hear what they think you want them to say. And that process takes time. So we built a series of workshops across a year and a half, which Adrien will talk more about how we could build relationships with these kids, I guess, get them to talk to us, find out what actually they cared about, what it felt like to be them, and start to build a piece from that.
Adrien, tell us about the workshops.
Yeah. First of all, I'm the worst English speaker in the universe.
Not true. Absolutely untrue.
Let's do it in New York at the French Library. So I need translation sometimes. The workshop is a very. C'était vraiment un moment très fort.
It's a very powerful moment in the workshop.
Et ce qu'il faut. You have to imagine that I don't write a word before the workshops. The idea is, on bâtit avec les enfants.
We used to work with the kids.
Et on avec leurs idées, step by step,
with their
we made
ideas.
an opera.
Yeah, and create an opera.
Yeah. So we did.
Voila.
Voilà, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Have a good evening.
Let me give you an example. During the, we talked a lot with teenagers. C'est horrible mon anglais. And at a moment, a little guy said, "We can imagine a world that where when we have 20 or 18, you disappear." Let's imagine something like that.
So the idea that in this world nobody exists past the age of 18 or 20. They just disappear.
They disappear.
When you turn that age, you're just gone.
So, yeah. And I say, okay, let's go. And that's the beginning of the show. So step by step.
I think another process that's really interesting when you're working with kids, and that I think I'm being nice to you today, Adrien, that Adrian's very good at, which is to see between the lines of what they say to what they mean. Do you know what I mean? And I think quite quickly you came up with a thing, Adrien, you were very sensitive, which was about borders, edges of things. About being when you're 15, 16, you don't know who you are, really. Your body doesn't know what it is, and you can't really understand who you'll be. Does that make sense? So you're on this edge between things, and that kind of frontier, this kind of edge of being an adult but being a child still, these shifts in your body, in your psychology, that always interested you, and you can feel it in them. So we found a funny thing where they had a really peculiar nostalgia for their own selves maybe a year or two before. Like, I'm now quite old, and I'll have that myself in my 20s. I go, oh my God, when I was 20. They'll do that from when they were 11, but they're 13. So they'll be like, oh, do you remember when we were in year 4 and it was like this and everyone did this? So their sense of time is very different to ours. And so their sense to be able to really project forwards is actually incredibly limited. They'll go, I'll be a fireman, but they can't really envisage it. And so trying to create a piece where that was a truth because they just disappeared was interesting. And I think, Adrien, you've got a real talent for that, which is about seeing actually what's it like to be them rather than to look at them. If that makes sense. So it's some of the pieces, I think, quite brave. I think it's quite challenging. It's quite emotionally difficult. But I think that's because you were trying to explore what's it like to feel like one of them rather than to look at them. And it's very different, I think.
The first question was, if you have to, if you can go to the theater tonight, what do you want to see on the stage? This is the first question we asked to the teenagers. They have absolutely no ideas. And they said something joyeux.
Something happy.
Something happy. But you talk with them 2 minutes and you realize that this is not so... C'est pas aussi simple.
It's not as straightforward as that.
Il y a un côté dark, il y a un côté... L'adolescence, c'est aussi cette part de sombre.
Yeah, there's a kind of, well, you can probably understand. There's a darkness, a sort of somberness in adolescence particularly. Yeah.
Il fallait jongler entre les deux. On veut la joie et en même temps, on vit avec quelque chose de sombre.
Right. So you have to play between the two. Do you know what I mean? They live with a sort of somberness. And I remember a little boy, Idris, who's very brilliant. And we were chatting with him and said, what do you care about? And he said he couldn't sleep. And we said, why can't you sleep? Because he just said, because I think there's going to be a war. Yeah, and so he's living in that space where he's expecting a war. So it was striking. I think we were really surprised by actually what they started to talk about.
Et finalement, when you think about l'adolescency in literature, no, c'est pas adolescency.
Adolescence. You're very close. Yep.
In literature, alors, Sa Majesté des Mouches, I don't know in English.
A Lord of the Flies.
It's not very funny. And everything is like that. Salinger n'écrit pas des choses très joyeuses sur l'adolescence. Il faut attraper ça, regarder ça, et pas regarder ça avec des yeux d'adultes qui jugent des adolescents.
It's like what I was saying, that you need to really be within the world, not to look at them from the outside, but to try to catch some of the truth of what it means to live as an adolescent. And I do think that's the thing that you've been really clearly exploring.
Thank you, James.
That's right. I told you I'm being nice to you.
It's the first time.
Ewan, you've been very quiet.
Oh, yeah, well, on purpose. I speak the international language of dance.
Well, can you tell us about how your involvement, were you involved in these workshops? Did you arrive afterwards?
No,
How
I
did you
came
translate?
slightly later to the process.
Yeah.
Obviously, as a choreographer, it's important to have some music. And we didn't have any music in the days of the workshops. So yeah, I did. I mean, James and I, have done lots of productions together and good friends. So I was kind of aware of what was happening and aware of the piece that we were creating. And it's a strong thing for me to have the involvement of the children and the young people, and for them to kind of create a language and a world that they feel comfortable in. I mean, when you look at them on stage at the first day rehearsals, they all just stand like literally like beanbags. They're so slumped and they have no confidence and no energy. And a big part of the process is kind of bringing that out. And if you then force on them steps and say, this is what you will do and I want you to do this and it must look like this, then you don't tend to get very exciting results. But letting them explore and find, you have to give them stuff, because if you ask them to do anything, they just look at you like, what, you want me to do it? And it's like, well, yeah, come on. But we give them something to do, to play with, to try. And then I think, I really think there's something quite beautiful about watching the different ways people move that maybe aren't, trained classically in ballet or jazz, and they haven't been. We work a lot. I worked a lot on Matilda, the musical, Margot's favourite musical, Matilda, in the UK and in Norway. And we spend a long time with the children, about 6 months, before we even start rehearsals, where we just train them. So it's like school. They learn, how to walk, how to stand, how to speak, how to sing, how to do a plie, how to do everything. And we drill them and drill them and drill them for 6 months. So by the end of that, they're like robots. And then when they get to do the show, they execute Peter Darling's choreography beautifully, and they look incredible doing it. But there's no expression, there's no character. It's just a performance. It's a piece of art that doesn't live, in my opinion. So to take these young people and kind of go, well, look, we could do something like this, but then the way that you do it is very different to the way that you do it, but that's fine. They can live together in a space and it can create something really beautiful. It's just living art, So yeah, that was kind of, I was always aware that we were going to be creating in the room. Time is short. It's a short rehearsal process, with the young people on what is a new musical, a new opera. Same thing. It's an opera with words. It's an opera with words. That's a musical, huh? So yeah, I was kind of always aware of the process and what these guys were up to, but certainly as far as the music and kind of starting to create choreography and a movement language for the piece, that was only maybe for us, me and James together, 2 or 3 months before we started the rehearsal process. Yeah,
just one thing. We are talking about 90, 100 kids on stage. 80, 85.
Yeah,
it's a huge
number.
Maîtrise. Okay. British humor.
Oui.
And the first for the first, it's assez rare. We start with the text, not with the music. Yes. Generally in opera, you have the music, and you write on the text on the music. Not this time.
I mean, again, alongside that, it's clear that when we were asked to make the piece, that I'm sure you probably know, in the tradition of opera comique, so opera comique was not comic opera. It was opera with text. That was the idea. So it could be serious text or not. So Carmen was first played at Opéra Comique. It was debuted there. So Opéra Comique, the tradition is that you have dialogue or spoken text and then music. So that was the difference between Opéra Comique and Paris opera, for instance, to Garnier, that sort of differentiated them. And Louis and Chrysaline, who run the theatre, were very clear with us that they wanted that. They were clear to carry on that tradition with this new piece, that it would have dialogue. So, and I have to say, it gives us a kind of triple threat for the kids, because they have to sing, and there's dance stuff, and they've got dialogue. So it's a huge challenge for them, because actually they've got to deliver all those things in a space that holds 1,200 people or something, and some of them are 12 years old. You know, and I had in my head, and they're great actually, because there's a kind of truth to them, which I find very interesting. They're not like I imagine stage school kids sometimes we can get in the UK where they'll come on and they're literally, bing, their little teeth do this and they're ready to go. They're not, they're literally teenagers.
The brilliant ones are the ones that do it wrong, huh?
Yeah.
There's the ones that they're facing the wrong way, and you're like, they're just brilliant. Yeah. They're the most entertaining because they're really real.
You're hired.
Yeah, so they're really real. They're not just doing things they've been told to do.
Yeah, so as you say, they're not sort of pre-programmed little kids that have been through years of stage school. They're actually really French teenagers who are taking part in a process, and it's great. Do you know what I mean? And it's amazing to engage with them in that, actually.
There was a brilliant moment today where there's a big moment where they kind of surge around the stage in a group. And as they surged, one went over, but then it was like a domino effect. So they all just went, and there was just 80 children face down on the floor. It was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, to the kind of thing that we were like, that should stay in. Like, that's good. We should keep that in the show. Yeah.
Well, I'm so struck by the similarities between the sort of process of creating the show, which is a process of resisting any sort of programming of these children, allowing them to liberate their own bodies, discover them, and the actual message of the show, which is also a sort of deprogramming, a liberation. Can you speak to the overlapping layers there between what you discovered in the workshop about children exploring their own boundaries, breaking out of things, and how that translated into the plot of this beautiful piece?
It's a quite a complex question. I think that because the nature of what we were setting out to do was to try to listen to them, that therefore inevitably that process in itself fed into the world that we then built. Do you see what I mean? So I've got a puppet by my side.
You do have a puppet. We haven't addressed the puppet yet. I think it's about time for
the
American Library to meet him.
We made these with the kids in the workshops. No, you can hold the puppet. Which we use them a lot in different forms of theatre. I worked on the same team that did Warhorse. I worked with a Handspring puppet company, and we made these to develop puppets for a show of Midsummer Night's Dream. And they're very useful anyway for a sort of proto-puppet format of working in puppetry. But we started using them in the workshops in part because the kids, you'd find that they would express an emotion to the puppet that they were just too embarrassed to do on their own, because they're, as I say, they're teenagers. And so to show real anger or be sad, or they often wouldn't do it, but they would with a puppet. They were emotionally open and expressive and would improvise in a way that they just didn't have the confidence. So they became really useful and interesting in the process. And then they've sort of ended up in the show, not in terms of sort of formal puppetry, but because Adrien took this idea of their emotional connection with the puppets, and it was a thing you'd thought of anyway in part. And so in the second act of the show, they end up on another island. This little child goes, and on this island they all carry puppets on their backs, and their puppets are made for them every day. A new puppet is made every day, and their puppets are their emotions, and they bear them around on their backs, and by the end of the day they're so exhausted they throw these puppets down a hole, and they get knitted a new one for the next day. So they go through an endless cycle of, and they forget. They forget at the end of every day what they did and how it was, and every day they get a new puppet, a new set of emotions that they carry around on their back. And then they throw it down the hole and get another. It's a bit more complex than that, but so that was a thing where there's a kind of interaction that went through the workshops of playing with the puppets, this idea of the emotions in the puppets, an inspiration that Adrien had, and it ends up in the show. So in some ways, I suppose what I'm saying is it's inevitable in some ways that some of the world of the show reflects the process, because it's what was going on. Is that fair, Adrien?
C'est ça. During the workshop, I realized the importance of borders between them. I don't want to touch you. I'm not sure. It's a very interesting way of I think about this during the writing of the show. And maybe juste un indice un personnage, a character qui a beaucoup animé nos discussions.
Animated our discussions a lot.
It's Peter Pan.
Oui.
But the first one, the real one, not Disney ones, from Barry, a Scottish writer, the first Peter Pan in the beginning of the 20th century, is very dark. Il oublie tout.
He forgets
every
everything.
day he
Every day he
forget what he
forgets.
did before. Et ça a beaucoup intéressé les enfants. On a
Kids
beaucoup
very struck by
travaillé
it.
sur ce personnage de Peter Pan. Encore une fois, le vrai Peter Pan, très complexe.
So we worked a lot on this. With the children, they're very engaged by this idea of the character of Peter Pan, who forgets everything that he's done every day. And so we worked a lot around that idea.
Because in a sense, that sort of eternal youth is to have no memory, to never build it or hold it.
I think that's right. And also this kind of boundary of ages, this idea of not growing up, but also what you're saying, Adrian, about the kids are really, always as kids are, aware of their relative age. So the 14-year-olds feel like the 11-year-olds are just somewhere
Infants.
else. Yes,
On
just
another
world.
planet.
Yeah. And the 19-year-olds are frankly adults. So there's this huge range within a kind of 3 or 4 year age group. And so we played with that. So where in the first act, you're in a world where no one goes past 20 because they just disappear, the child gets expelled from the island. He gets thrown out.
Let's maybe walk through the plot of the show a bit for those who have not seen it, which is this entire audience because it hasn't opened yet. Because I think this will help clarify things as well. So before we get to the island where everything is forgotten, the play opens, and it's 2 children. One child is not the play. I'm sorry, the opera. The musical opens. There's a child weighing himself, and then there's another child.
So there's the show opens. There's a couple of kids on the swing, and we've ended up with it actually being a boy and a girl. When Adrian wrote it, so I'm now speaking for you, he very deliberately didn't make them either gender. So they're just off on 1 and off on 2.
And they're nameless, which is
And they're
important.
nameless, which partly is inspired by me.
The creative genius of the show.
No, not at all. Until I was at school in a kind of ridiculous school in England. Until I was 13, I had no name. I was a number. So I was number 83 was my number. So we live in
British humor again.
I really was number 83. So these kids don't have names, and it's 2 kids on the swing, and one of them is kind of singing, going, her height and her weight. And the other kid goes, what are you doing? What are you doing that for? And she's going, well, these numbers could be important when I get to the other side. Anyway, it transpires that she's about to turn 20. So she's about to disappear. And they go on and have a sort of ceremony of departure for those people who are turning 20, in which they're finally getting a name. So 5 minutes before you disappear, you get a name. And they have a sort of celebration, a kind of festival with a kind of, everyone turns up and goes, this is great, and we're all really happy about this, and isn't it brilliant, and we're all really great, and thank God this is happening, and we're so glad we're getting a name, and actually they're terrified because they don't know. And to that extent, it's a metaphor for all of us, approaching boundaries of things we don't understand, and a metaphor for childhood and adulthood. And so these kids go, and this, just at the end of the scene, actually it's very beautiful, at the end of the first scene, the younger kid, who's not yet due to leave, says to the older one, his friend, I love you. And the older kid turns around and goes, well, okay, love you too. And it turns out that in this world they're in, you talked always, Adrian, about a kind of world of transparency, of light, where nothing is hidden, no emotions allowed, and nothing can be concealed. And that feels like social media now, where everything's seen and known and exposed. So there is no mobile phones in the play. It's not like that. But it's a world in the first things where everything's controlled. So anyway, they disappear, the friend disappears, and this kid starts to ask questions. Goes, well, why? Why should we do it? Why don't I have a name?
Quintessential child's question. It's the first question the child ever asks.
And it turns out that this world is sort of controlled and maintained by this trio of people who control the world, and they kind of interrogate the child, and they send him to have his sort of brain cleaned by this puiser, which comes straight from Peter Pan. Yeah. It says in Peter Pan, the mum goes inside the kids' heads every night to sort of tidy up. And that's where she sees the traces of Peter. So the puiser goes inside the kid's brain and kind of sees what's going on and comes out and goes, oh my God, this is a disaster.
This is a mess.
This is a kind of absolute
This
clinical
kid's
case.
having doubts. He's asking
he's
questions.
got questions.
He's thinking
feeling
critically.
emotions. And he comes out with this little file, and they go, what is that? He goes, this is tears. And I'm like, oh my God. So they go, there's nothing we can do. This kid's just a wipeout. It's a disaster.
Get
the only
this
thing we
guy
do is
off the
we have to
island.
get him off the island. Expel him. So they expel him to another island, which is Act 2, Adrian. And on this other island, nobody grows up. So when you get there, you arrive at an age and you're fixed at that age forever. So there's one kid that says, well, I'm 9. because I came when I was 9. So you don't grow up anymore. You're sort of fixed. And this is the island where there's this character, the tricoteur, who knits the puppets for the kids. So they're in a kind of endless cycle of emotional experience, which they didn't have in the first, but one that they lose every day, so it doesn't sort of accumulate. And they're all pale, these kids. And at one point, he starts off the kid going, oh, you're really pale. You okay? You're eating? It's all good? Because you don't look great. And they're like, well, yeah, we're fine. And it turns out that the reason they're losing their color is that they're losing their emotions every day. Every day they throw them away, so they drain their emotions out of themselves. And he meets another boy there called Maverick, who he makes friends with a very nice reference, Adrian, and musically to the far west of the USA, I guess out in Wyoming or maybe Utah, where he says to him, why are you called Maverick? And he goes, well, they have these herds of wild horses. And on the edge of the herd, there's often one horse that lives slightly apart. Not really part of the herd, but never too far away, slightly separated. And they're called the Maverick. And that's my name. That's what I do. That's what I'm like. And this kid lives down the hall where they throw the puppets, and he recycles the puppet materials. So he unpicks the material that's been knitted, cleans it all up, and sends it back up again. And so they make friends. He goes down the hole, and Maverick tells him that he understands that there's a boat that leaves the island. And he could get away on this boat. He doesn't know where to. There's no answer. There's some food and water on the boat, but it just sets sail to somewhere he doesn't know where. And so he goes. And then Act 3 is this kid afloat in the ocean on a boat surrounded by fireflies. Going he doesn't know where, but somewhere. It's very beautiful and very strong and powerful and metaphorical, and it's a good metaphor really for what it is to walk towards adulthood. You don't know where you're going, but you go. I think it's interesting.
You speak very well about the livret.
I read
Congratulations. The most important verb I think, in life maybe, but in the show, is to live. This kid wants to live.
I'm genuinely checking that it's leave or live. Vivre or partir?
Live. Partir.
To go. Okay. Yeah, to move on.
Sorry.
I just literally for the Zoom people I wanted to check. Leave and live. Oui, c'est ça.
L-E-A-V-E.
Thanks, Adrian. I just wanted to check.
Leave, left.
But speak more about this act of leaving. How did you arrive upon that as the central anxiety?
Alors là, peut-être parce que c'est moi qui parle plus que eux, mais excuse me, but when you have maybe 15 today, and someone come to you and say, you have to save the world. This is what they heard all the time. Yeah. Last chance, I just want to live.
It's all on you.
Yeah, I want to leave this world. I'm not here to save the world. That's why they don't want they didn't want to talk about the planets in this show. Oh no, it's enough. Every day we heard about this, and this is the last chance. No. So maybe grandir, c'est vouloir fuir ça.
So maybe to grow up is to want to escape.
Yeah, in a way. Mais peut-être que c'est finalement ça, grandir. C'est partir. Je sais pas.
Yeah, so maybe growing up in the end is to leave.
The kid always, during the show, asks questions. Always. And he just wants to have the right to ask questions. That's all.
Et je vais poser la question en français. Is there anyone who doesn't understand French at all? Aside from the man sitting next to me. mais la décision de laisser la fin ouverte, pourquoi?
Decision to leave the end actually open. It's ambiguous, the end. You don't know quite what's happened.
Ça, c'est parce que je crois que... Enfin, c'est... Quand j'écris des livres, quand je raconte une histoire, c'est une co-construction, coproduction avec celui qui lit ou celui qui regarde.
So when he writes a story or a book, it's a kind of it's an act of kind of correspondence, a collaboration with the person that's reading it or experiencing it. You're actually in dialogue with them.
Je veux, j'espère que chacun peut mettre sa part dans le livre ou dans le spectacle. Que chacun se fasse son spectacle avec sa suite ces parts d'ombre à inventer. Un livre, c'est un bout du chemin, mais il y a encore une part du chemin qu'on peut faire soi tout seul.
So it's really that each person who watches it is taking their own trajectory through it and putting a part of their own story into it and make their own shape to the story, and that it's the same with a book. When you read a book, it's a pathway, and then you take your own pathway with it.
This is sort of in the same way that the child chooses the unknown, ultimately chooses to embrace it. We are also forced to confront and embrace that which is unknown to us.
I was going to say, there was a brilliant moment yesterday where we were talking about something quite technical that happens on stage, and how we understood that thing, what that thing was, what it made, what emotion it gave us. And then all three of us had a different idea of what that thing meant when it happened, but none of us were right or wrong, you know? Because I was like, well, for me, that's because this is what happens. And James says, well, that's not what's happened. This is what's happened. And the same for Adrien, which is quite nice, you know? I think sometimes you watch a film or a TV series that has an ambiguous ending, and you think, like, I just wanted to know, did they live or did they die?
Did he kill them?
With this, you don't need to know. Do you know what I mean? You make up your own version of what you want it to be, and that's kind of brilliant. Yeah, I think.
I think it's really important. And the other thing, Adrien, that you have done with it, that was interesting when we had a kind of sing-through, read-through just with us in a room in September of this kind of first version of the score, and Isabel herself wasn't happy with the end she'd made. She's like, yeah, there's something wrong with it. And we were chatting, and I said, yeah, it's funny, because for me, one of the things that wasn't working was that Adrien's deliberately made a piece which asks questions. So you're left asking questions, not given answers. And what Isabel had written in September was an answer musically. And actually, you've deliberately made a kid that asks questions, and then the piece is asking questions. It doesn't provide you the solutions. And she went, oh, that's right. Actually, she then has worked musically to not provide a solution, but to leave us with a question. I think that's a kind of important part of the structure.
I want to ask you some questions sort of about the landscape of contemporary opera more broadly, but first, poor Ewan still has not spoken enough. So
I really don't
so
mind.
Ewan, you get to this production. You've worked with these people before. You think you know what you're getting into. You arrive, and you're given puppets and a knitter that lives at the bottom of a well. How do you choreograph this? How did you bring the puppets into the choreography? What other elements did you include for the ceremony, for the different
it's quite hard, isn't it? I think my first response is always to the music. So, you know, I've done some crazy operas with James. I've done some crazy musicals. But your first response is to the music. And I think that, for me, that my initial kind of the way the music makes me want to move. Certainly on a piece like this, if you're doing a piece that's particularly grounded in a certain culture or time period, you can draw on those references to create the choreography. So I've done, work that's kind of loosely based in 1940s dance, but then I did a version of The Wizard of Oz where the Munchkin choreography was kind of based on tribal dances of Peru, and we used that as the ground and the foundation of the work that we made. There's no point of reference for this show. Do you know what I mean? So it was just, well, how will they move when they're carrying puppets on their backs? We know that they've been drained of emotion and they've played all day, so they're tired, they're exhausted. Okay, so let's just play tired, let's play exhausted. How does that affect us physically? How do we move like that? So we're not going to move fast, we're going to move slow, but that doesn't mean we can't move fast through a roll or something that kind of, where we progress more quickly across the floor. So it's kind of, a response to the music and then a response to the narrative of the piece. None of the choreography. I mean, there's a moment at the beginning which is kind of loosely based on games and kind of calisthenics and exercise. But the rest of the choreography is not really steps. It's movement. It's kind of interpreting an emotion through a movement rather than let's do kick, we'll change, whack, split, And there's a place for that, and I love that. But that's not the kind of movement in the show. And a lot of the work, certainly when you're working with all of the company, so when there is 84 of them on stage in Act 3, it's actually about making beautiful pictures. And it's working out how can, the stage at the Opéra Comique isn't huge. So when you fill it with 83 people, there's not a lot of room. So it's how can these 83 people, who in that moment are kind of portraying the voices of a firefly. You know, what can we do with them that will kind of visually match the language of the music that Isabella's written, or that will match the, you know, the aesthetic of the piece or the mood and tone of that song. It's kind of painting pictures with bodies rather than trying to create physical choreography with jazz steps, you know, like in the style of Bob Fosse or something. Yeah.
I want to ask you, as I'm quickly running out of time here, you've written the most beautiful, the three of you, I don't know who wrote this exactly, but one of you did, I hope, the most beautiful sort of artistic manifesto to accompany the show. And in it you write, in a world in which the established norm is to revive operas that have already been written, to be given the opportunity of collaborating on the creation of a new and original piece of work is the greatest gift and an act of real trust. And then you continue, if opera is to have a future, it must lie in our future, and that is precisely the foundation of Archipel, the members of the Maîtrise Populaire. So I'm struck by many different sort of currents of thought in what you've written here. There seems to be a tension between revival, heritage, the grand legacy of opera, and then the idea of opera for the future. And I'm particularly struck by the use of the word if. It seems to be that the future of opera is in question. So do you think that opera is in danger, and why, and what do we do?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, kind of desperately in danger.
Why?
Because it's tricky. So the best example I can give is that in the UK, for instance, has a big theatre kind of ecosystem. And the National Theatre in London has attached to it the National Theatre Studio that was set up by Laurence Olivier when he set up the National Theatre. And it's separate from it, but related. Has its own funding stream. And they have, in any 1 week, 180 plays in development every week. And they have 6 floors high, and they have writers, they have writing rooms. So across a year, they're churning out thousands of plays. And those are not just done in London. They're made then for Sheffield, or they go all over the place. They may have a production that's actually for Edinburgh, but they'll come and use that resource. Opera in the UK, we have 1 a year that's new. 1. And the trouble is that we know, look, theatre art is a form of business. There's economies of scale. So if you only have one fashion designer, he better be bloody good. As in, you need loads of crap fashion to get the good fashion. You need loads of rubbish plays to be written to get the good ones. You need loads of rubbish operas. The 18th century, they wrote huge amounts of awful opera, and we got this bit left. So if we're going to tell stories for now that speak to us now, in which we see ourselves, in which we understand ourselves, that's, of course, all the heritage of opera is great, there's no problem with it. But if we want to move it forwards, you've got to make work. And if you don't do it, forget it. You're a heritage art form that's looking backwards. And I'm a director, you can endlessly reinterpret Marriage of Figaro, all you want is a brilliant piece, keep going. But to make work where people see themselves now, then this is it. You have to, and to do that, you've got to engage with the generation that's coming, not the one that's there already. So that's why, I think it's really true. And across the US, I work a lot in the US, across the UK, in France, opera funding is being absolutely devastated because most people don't go. That's why. It appeals to a very tiny portion of the population and it's very expensive. So I think if we're going to justify it, you've got to find ways to make it relevant, to speak to now. It doesn't mean you do rubbish. It's really hard to do. But you've got to begin with a real intention to actually engage with something, which I think you've done and Isabel's done. And the Opéra Comique, I'd meant that about an act of trust. It's an act of trust. We could have just done something awful. We might have done. Could still be awful.
No one's seen the show yet. We actually don't know.
No, we don't know, and we haven't seen anyone see it. But the point is, you try. You have a go. You don't know, but you try. And you do that in good faith.
Adrien, vous êtes aussi un écrivain journaliste et à la fois vous écrivez des librettos. Qu'est-ce que l'opéra peut accomplir que les autres arts ne sont pas capables de réaliser, de transmettre? What can opera transmit, achieve that other art forms cannot access, can't capture?
That's a very good question. 2 years ago, I didn't know anything about opera. Je pense que les émotions sont incomparables. You're playing, you sing, you play, you dance, you share something with the public. What else? It's an amazing moment. That's why Archipel is c'est très ambitieux.
It's very ambitious.
Et je pense que c'est précieux. Precious. Moi, je l'ai découvert, l'opéra, j'ai 40 ans. J'ai mis 38 ans à rentrer dans un opéra. Maybe it's a problem.
It wasn't
for me.
It wasn't until he was 38 years old that he was really discovering opera.
Yeah. Et c'est pour ça, James a commencé en présentant la maîtrise. Maîtrise populaire. If you have just one word to remember tonight, it's populaire. Je viens vous chercher, je vous prends par la main et je vous fais passer les portes de cet endroit qui est fait pour vous autant que pour n'importe qui, même si ce n'est pas votre culture ou votre milieu social.
I'll come find you, look for you, take you by the hand and take you through the door of this place that might not feel like it's made for you, but it is, it can be.
Can we have a final round of applause, please, for brilliant speakers tonight? Thank you so much, Adrien, James, Ewan, for speaking with us here tonight, for presenting your beautiful, beautiful show. It's just been such a delight to kind of get inside the world of Archipel, and I'm so excited for it to take life on stage as well and to open to the public. We now have time to open this up to questions from our audience. So we'll start with our in-person audience, and if you're on Zoom, send your question in the chat, and we'll come take a look at that as well. So in person, I will give my microphone to Alfonso, and he will bring the microphone to you in a relay system. Here we go.
Thank you very much. This was very enlightening and very enjoyable. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking at least one of the things that you've managed to accomplish is to create a therapeutic environment similar to group therapy. But beyond that, what I'm very interested in is understanding how you define success. Can you measure your success? And then how does that measurement of success alter what you do?
It's a good question. I think it's very interesting because I think there are many. It's quite interesting that often in theatre you measure success by kind of bums on seats at the end of the day. It's like how many people bought the ticket, or is it by reviews? And again, there's a really interesting question to be asked in this process, which is the pedagogical success, which is this is a process for each of these kids. It's a process for the Maîtrise. It's a process for their experience of going through the rehearsal process, the creative process. So I think there's one set of parameters you could look at it by as is in how have they experienced it. And they could do that even if just their mums and dads came. So there's certainly a kind of sort of one could parse the success in a way that one might not normally, because you can really look at it and go, how has that succeeded? What's that done? Then there's the question of how does it go down with the public, if you come and see it, or with reviews or Opéra Comique generally, and the reputation of the Maîtrise Populaire, how that manages that. And then beyond that, there's a question of have we collectively, particularly in Adrien and Isabel in the writing, have we made something that resonates? That the piece itself, because there's a production that you and I, we might have made a mess of or not, but then there's also the piece that we made, because this isn't just about putting on a show, it's actually creating a new piece. So I think there's several levels to look at it at, and some of them will be materially measured, I guess. Sometimes a piece lives or gets judged by its further life. Do you see what I mean? Does it mean that actually this picks up and other people kind of go, oh, that's interesting, that's speaking to something. So I guess time will tell for some of it. And in the shorter period, really, one can assess, I guess I'm sure there'll be feedback stuff with the kids about what have they got from it and how have they changed and what have they learned.
It's a very academic question for a dancer. I'm on a personal level, for me, it's if I finish or if a project concludes and I feel like I have given everything I could to that job, then I would consider that a success on a personal level. Whether the job gets negative reviews or no one buys a ticket or whatever, if I feel that I've given enough of myself, you know, that I don't walk away thinking, oh, I could have done better, you know, or I could have tried harder, or I could have worked harder, and I have a group of, in this case, a group of children who look like one tiny thing in their life has been changed by experiencing this 6-week rehearsal process with us, then on a personal level, the job is a success. You know, I'd love huge financial successes. But for now, I'm very happy to go with, as long as I feel like I've done my gig, then I feel like it's been a success.
I absolutely have no idea what is the success. 2 days ago, at the end of the rehearsal, the last seconds of the show, silence, and they applaud themselves, kids. That's a sign of success, maybe.
It's excuse me, it sounds like these kids, the show has been developed around these kids, or these kids have developed the show. So having said that, can you take it to another city and duplicate this same performance?
Choreographically, certainly. That I think the purpose of making this piece is that you would. So you know, in theatre and opera, we replicate sometimes. So you have a replica production of a show. I have a production of Phantom, which is running in a few different cities. It's exactly the same show. Matilda is exactly the same show. This at the moment isn't that show. This would, if the show was to be done somewhere else, yeah, we'd take the music, we'd take the words, we'd take the lyrics to the songs, but certainly choreographically we would adapt totally to suit what those kids can do. James and I did a production of West Side Story a few years ago, which is challenging within itself because it was a non-replica, so we had complete freedom to change all of Jerome Robbins' choreography, and we had a chorus of, I don't know, 30 kids maybe, that kind of made up the two gangs. We had professionals singing the lead roles of Maria and Tony, etc., but we kind of had this group of kids, and we did the same thing. We built all the choreography around what they could do. We just spent days going, can you break dance? Can you do parkour? You know, what do you like to do? And we had a plan for that show that we would roll it out over various different cities, and every city we would recreate the world based on what the kids can do. Because I think otherwise, the time and effort, and I use Matilda a lot as a reference just because it's such a famous production, but the time and effort that goes into making that show, you don't always have that luxury to work for 6 months with a group of children, basically take them out of school and train them up. You don't always have that luxury. So I think if you can create a piece that can then just change and develop and evolve in every city, then there's something really exciting about that too. Yeah.
Maybe it is a sign of success if you are able to play the show in America, in Italy, I don't know where, and on s'y reconnaît quand même. Comment tu traduis ça?
They recognize themselves even there. But I think that the way that the story's structured, the way that you've written it, they can. There's a universality in the world of reference. It's why things like Peter Pan, do you know what I mean? Those kind of reference points are quite universal. It's like when we said some of those things, you all nodded. Because you go, oh yeah, I feel that. Yeah, and I think that adds a kind of universality that means that it doesn't feel, we've not tended to tie it to these kids in specifics, if that makes sense.
And this is the last part of my question. What you've done is created an environment whereby the kids can face things and realize things about themselves that they haven't before. What about you? How does that affect you? Sorry.
Let me help you, Ewan. It's a very personal answer. When I was a teenager, I lost memories of things in my past. Maybe I didn't live j'ai pas vécu mon adolescence normalement.
He didn't live his adolescence in a normal fashion.
Maybe. So, in a way, during 1 year and a half, j'ai découvert mon adolescence.
He's having his adolescence now
with kids.
Through this process.
C'est comme aller chez le psy. Comme aller chez le
Like
psychologue.
going to a therapist.
Yeah, voilà. C'est moins cher. J'ai été payé pour aller chez le psy.
I can't be that interesting. I don't know, I think there's a couple of things. One is I've never done a show where you don't discover stuff about yourself. It's such a kind of complex process between the interaction with the piece, with the team of people you're making things with, sometimes with new relationships. We hadn't worked together before. But particularly when you work with children, it's no different to being a parent. It's impossible to parent a child and not just be changed. You just are. You're changed by those people. You're changed through your interactions with them. You're changed by the things they reflect back at you of yourself. So for certain, I don't know that I can express it as cogently as Adrien did. But there's no question that one is changed by it because you just are, that interaction and that connection. And actually sometimes there's a sheer bloody number of them. There's just a lot. And so you're kind of there in the room with sort of 85 kids and their energy, and it changes you.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to articulate, I suppose, but for me, you'll see the kids, there'll be a handful, 1 or 2, who I can see myself at their age having some kind of revelation or realization of how amazing this is. And maybe for them to think, wow, imagine going on and making a career out of just doing this, which kind of makes me realize that I was that kid and how lucky I am now to do what I do. So there's a kind of instill some kind of, I don't know, memory of, I don't know. It's hard to articulate, but I definitely see that and think I was like him and I would have dreamed when I was his age of being what I am now within the world of theatre and opera.
Can we have a final round of applause, please?